So it is really, really a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Ronni Baer to be as the inaugural Saunders lecturer for this year. So Dr. Ronni Baer comes to us from Princeton University, where she's a distinguished curator and lecturer in the museum and the Department of Art and Archaeology. An internationally acclaimed specialist in European art of the 17th century, she worked in curatorial departments in New York and Atlanta before joining the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where she served as senior curator of European paintings for almost 20 years. There, she spearheaded numerous projects, and including the promised gift of the collections of Rosemary and Eike von Otterlo and Susan and Matt Weatherby. If you go to the MFA Boston and you understand the richness and extraordinary quality of its collection of Dutch art, we all owe that to Dr. Ronni Baer. Dr. Ronni Baer is an acknowledged expert on the painting of Gerrit Dou in particular, Dou in French, but Dou here, about whom she wrote her dissertation. She was the curator of, among other exhibitions, Gerrit Dou, Rembrandt's first pupil in 2000, The Poetry of Everyday Life, Dutch Painting in Boston in 2002, El Greco to Velázquez, Art During the Reign of Philip III in 2008, and more recently, Class Distinctions, Dutch Painting in the Age of Rembrandt and Vermeer. For her work in furthering knowledge and appreciation of Spanish and Dutch art and culture, Dr. Ronni Baer was knighted by King Juan Carlos of Spain in 2008 and by King Willem Alexander of the Netherlands in 2017. We're very honored, very happy that she is coming to talk to us tonight about the rough and the smooth in 17th century Dutch painting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ronni Baer.
Good evening, welcome. I am absolutely thrilled to be here, and if I can figure out how this works, it'll be a miracle. Let's see. Okay. Right. Okay. I am incredibly honored to have been asked to deliver the inaugural Saunders Lecture here at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Thank you to Alex Nargis, Michael Taylor, Sylvain Cordier, and Teresa Cunningham for your warm welcome, and especially Celeste Feta and Katie Domerat for making the arrangements for me to be here tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the helpful catalog entries and essay by Arthur K. Wheelock in the catalog with Observation and Imagination, Still Lives, Genre Scenes, Portraits, and Landscapes from the Saunders Collection, which was published by the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in 2021. And of course, heartfelt thanks to my wonderful friend Jordan Saunders. I wanted to start by briefly describing my connection to Tom and Jordan Saunders. And no, this painting on the screen is not a 17th century Dutch still life. In 2009, the MFA Boston, where, as you heard, I was senior curator, was a venue for an exhibition organized by the National Gallery of Art of paintings by Luis Melendez. Although he aspired to be history painter to the king, his temperament made him unsuitable. Instead, and to make a living, he decided to paint still lives. His success in this field finally led to a royal commission in 1771 at age 56 from the Prince of Asturias, later King Charles IV, to provide paintings for the royal palace's new Cabinet of Natural History. Melendez's works were to depict, quote, the 4 seasons of the year, with the aim of composing an amusing cabinet with every species of food produced by the Spanish climate, end quote. 44 still lives eventually constituted the project. No cauliflower is mentioned as part of the series, so it's thought that this work preceded the commission. The arresting image and the virtuosity of its execution demonstrate why Melendez's paintings must have appealed to his royal patron and why he received such an important commission. It was certainly a standout in the Melendez exhibition. Unusually for a tabletop still life, the painting has a vertical format. The tightly cropped image gives the composition a physical sense of tension. The dark background serves to accentuate, by force of contrast, the volume and chromatic intensity of the luminous objects placed in front of it. The space appears deep as Melendez placed objects one behind another. He hints at the illusionistic possibilities of the still life by including elements, specifically the cauliflower leaves, that appear to project beyond the tabletop. Not a literal copy of nature, a painting like this is a virtuoso example of the artist's skill in depicting the intricacies of composition, the arrangement of space, the rendering of light and dark, and the depiction of textures, reflections, and materials. Look at the stiff paper cone, the various foodstuffs, and how he distinguishes between copper, ceramic, metal, osier, and twine that make up the basket. Great artistic virtuosity links Melendez's work to the oil sketches of Peter Paul Rubens of about a century earlier. And Rubens, like Melendez, links the Saunderses to me. In December of 2021, the Princeton University Art Museum placed a successful bid at auction in London for the oil sketch on the right. It depicts Ganymede, who because of his beauty was abducted by Jupiter, or his eagle, and made the god's cupbearer on Mount Olympus. On the left is the Saunders' oil sketch of the abduction of Deianira by Nessus. The centaur Nessus offered to carry Hercules' wife Deianira across the river Eunos, but while doing so, he decided instead to abduct her. In response to his wife's cries for help, Hercules shot a poisoned arrow, killing the centaur and preserving Deianira's virtue. These works were both part of a commission Rubens, arguably the most famous and successful artist in 17th century Europe, received late in his life for more than 60 paintings on mythological themes for the Torre de la Parada, King Philip IV's hunting lodge located in a large park about 9 miles outside Madrid. Rubens was presumably tasked with this enormous job, not only because he had a large workshop and had carried out other major decorative ensembles for European royalty, but also because he was the expert on rendering the gods and heroes of antiquity. He painted all 60 of the oil sketches quite rapidly as studies for larger paintings, some of which were painted by him, but most executed by other Antwerp artists. Both of these stories are recounted in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and both would have appealed to Philip IV's taste for sensual subjects. But they also share the theme of the destructive power of love's passion, and would have played an edifying role as moral meditations on the responsibility of power. They are negative exempla of self-conduct. That is, they depict lustful actions that lead to the loss of self-control, often with horrifying results. In effect, they served as warnings to the young monarch. You see in both sketches how quickly Rubens went about describing his subjects. On a brushy imprimatura or ground layer, he used firm brown lines to outline the figure's poses, and then colored them in to varying degrees and with varying amounts of paint. Although equally small, nothing could be further from Rubens's swift and broad handling than this painting, which is what initially and happily brought me into the Saunders orbit. When I was writing my dissertation, which was a catalogue raisonné of the paintings of Gerrit Dou, this picture was in a private collection in Montreal. But when I went to borrow paintings from my monographic exhibition that Sylvain referenced earlier, on the artist that was held at the National Gallery of Art, the Mauritshuis and Dulwich Picture Gallery in 2000, it was in the Saunders' apartment in New York. Tom and I spent quite some time looking at it together and marveling at Dou's painstaking technique. I think at the time, Jordan was setting up for a dinner party for a political dignitary. I remember thinking that the bunting around the table looked incredibly festive. Gerrit Dou was Rembrandt's first pupil. This early work by Dou already shows the qualities of his painting style that eventually made him one of the most famous Dutch artists of the 17th century. Dou came to work with Rembrandt in 1628, when he was a boy of 15 and Rembrandt was only 18. The young pupil would have seen Rembrandt's paintings like this one, of old men in a barely defined interior, surrounded by an array of objects that allude to their identity and preoccupations. The two scholars are likely Saints Peter and Paul, who are shown discussing a passage in a large book, probably the Bible. Images of books and scholars characterize quite a bit of the art created in the Dutch town of Leiden in the late 1620s and 1630s. At the time, the city was a cultural, intellectual, and commercial crossroads for much of Europe. It was also the seat of the first Protestant university in the Netherlands, a powerful center of Orthodox Calvinism. This early painting by Rembrandt exhibits the dramatic contrast of light and shadow, known as chiaroscuro, that characterizes much of his work at the time Dou was in his studio. While the heads, hands, and feet have been painted with attention to the men's wrinkles and veins, the highest lights are applied with thicker paint, which suggests a three-dimensional plasticity. And I'm afraid you can't get most of this in slides, but that's all we have unless we go to Melbourne. The tablecloth and still life on the floor are painted with a rather heavy impasto, that is thickly applied paint, with lumpy pigment in the brightest areas. By contrast, the still life items on the table in the background, an extinguished candle atop a book, more books, and a large globe, are less strongly lit and thus painted more thinly. This example shows that Rembrandt varied his brushwork to describe the position in space these objects occupy. Dou would have also seen this painting by Rembrandt of a young artist standing at a distance from a large, brightly lit panel viewed from the back. The painter is clothed in a rather fanciful, oversized tabard against the chill of a damp studio. He holds brushes and a palette. Behind him are another palette, vials, and jars for his painting oils and varnishes, and a stone for grinding pigments. Dwarfed by the painting on the easel, is he contemplating what he should paint? That is this about artistic creation, or has he stepped back to assess his work in progress? The ambiguity of the image contributes to making this small work so captivating. The strong chiaroscuro, harmonious use of a limited color palette, and evocative descriptions of surfaces and materials are hallmarks of Rembrandt's early style. While there are areas of finely controlled brushwork, and my favorite thing is here, this thin white line that describes the edge of the panel, but also how very carefully he depicts the hardware on the door. We also see broadly applied paint that mimics the wood grain of the floorboards and the peeling plaster of the walls. Rembrandt here varied his brushwork depending on what he was describing, so not so much the position in space, but actually the physical characteristics of the materials. Not so Dou. You can see elements in the Saunders painting on the left that Dou would have learned from his master, a studious old man in a large but better defined space, seated rather than standing before an easel with a panel, its back to the viewer. On the raised table in the background is a book with a candlestick on it, and behind that, a large globe, both details found in Rembrandt's Melbourne painting at top right. Like Rembrandt's young figure in Boston at bottom right, Dou's elderly man is absorbed. He writes in a large folio that he holds up close to his nearsighted eyes. His glasses actually mimic the best way to view Dou's small paintings, that is, under magnification. But while it shares many characteristics with Rembrandt's early works, Dou's manner of painting couldn't be more different. A bright light penetrates the interior from the window at left, illuminating the figure and throwing the recesses of the space into shadow. Dou used a tiny brush to describe the wrinkles in the old man's face and the shape of his ear. Single specks of gold, pigment, represent the beads on his cap. The color combinations of purple, blue, and aqua applied in great unmodulated areas in, for example, his tabard and the table covering at back, are typical of Dou's early work and probably relate to his earliest training as a glass painter. The accumulation of accessories made of various materials and textures gives definition to the space and meaning to the image. For example, look at the meticulously described still life of shield, helmet, drum, and bandolier that anchors the lower right corner of the composition. It might be intended to allude to the active life, in contrast to the contemplative, cerebral life of the scholar-artist. Regardless of meaning, it certainly heralds Dou's painterly ability. As we saw with Melendez, it signals Dou's virtuosity, and this would be one of the hallmarks of his art. In the 17th century, beginning with the painter and art theoretician Karl von Mander in his treatise on the art of painting published in 1604, Dutch art theorists discussed two distinct styles of painting, neat, smooth, and rough, loose. These self-portraits by Dou at left and Rembrandt at right epitomize their signature or mature styles. Dou's painting is fine and highly embellished, exemplifying his neat, copious style. His works are invariably painted on panel, a smooth, hard support, perfect for his meticulous painting style. He shows himself here as a scholarly painter, dressed in tabard and beret, holding a palette and brushes. A bust, écorché figure, and easel, barely visible in the background, allude to the tools of his trade. The plaster medallion on the face of the wall may allude to the paragone, illustrating the supremacy of painting over sculpture. In essence, while sculptors can't imitate painting, painters can imitate sculpture. The elaborate fiction of the art-shaped window surround and ledge over which objects extend show his illusionistic prowess. The tapestry curtain, showing every warp and weft thread, announces the theatricality of the image, and the flask with liquid underscores his unerring ability to capture reflections and shadows. Here, the erudition of the image goes hand in hand with the refinement of the handling. However, while his images exhibit his careful observation of nature and the effects of light, one would never mistake his paintings for a straightforward depiction of an actual subject before his eyes. Von Mander noted that neat painting engaged the viewer for a long time, delighting his or her eyes. And the 17th century compiler of artists' biographies, Joachim von Sondraart, who had visited Dou's studio in 1639, emphasized that Dou painted in a manner, quote, never before seen, end quote, which was achieved through great diligence and patience. The 17th century champion for the smooth manner was Philips Angel, who, in a lecture delivered to his fellow artists in Leiden in 1641, heaped praise on his compatriot Gerrit Dou, whose art he esteemed as the paradigm of fine painting. Quote, if someone chooses neatness for his study, let him practice that which is perseveringly observed by Gerrit Dou, for whom no praise is sufficient, namely, a curious looseness that he guides with a sure and certain drawing hand, end quote. This style, which came to be known as Feinschilderei, or fine painting, was so popular, particularly in Leiden, that his many students tried to imitate it well into the 18th century. Dou's relatively small paintings, with their remarkable surfaces, demand to be seen close to. In fact, some were originally protected by cases that required actual manipulation on the part of the viewer. he or she would have had to remove or open the painted cover to reveal another painting within. As an example, I show you this 18th century Dutch watercolor with a painting with open doors on the back wall that shows how a kaas or case might have functioned. The watercolor represents the art cabinet of the timber merchant and shipbroker and one of the most important collectors in 18th century Holland, Ploos van Amstel. As we see in the image, art like this could best be appreciated in proximity. Saunders, who had visited Dou's studio in 1639, metaphorically called Dou and his master Rembrandt entirely different flowers grown in the same garden. In his self-portrait of 1659, Rembrandt presents himself plainly, 3/4 length, his body turned to the left, while his face turns to look directly out at the viewer. Although he wears a painter's beret, there are no accoutrements or other allusions to his profession. His hands are clasped in front of him. His head, which receives the light most strongly, emerges from the darkish background. The artist uses a limited palette, but if you look closely, and I hope you can see it on the detail on the right, you can see his face is composed of a rich range of pinks and other flesh tones, applied with thick impastos and bold strokes. There's an almost sculptural quality to the modeling. This painting on canvas, typical for Rembrandt in Amsterdam as opposed to the panels used by Dou, exemplifies Rembrandt's innovative and self-conscious rough and broad style. While neat paintings delighted the viewer with a profusion of detail, the liveliness and boldness of the rough manner had the power to touch and move the observer, activating his or her deepest emotions and stimulating his or her imagination. According to the biographer Arnold Houbraken, in his The Great Theater of Dutch Painters, written in 1718 to 21, the art of Rembrandt possessed something new in its time. He recounts that visitors trying to get a close look at Rembrandt's canvases were told, quote, "The smell of paint would annoy you," end quote. This then was an art to be appreciated from a distance. Dou worked with tiny brushes in a smooth manner, continuing the type of painting that would have been associated with Jan van Eyck, whose self-portrait of 1433 you see on the left, and the early Netherlandish tradition. According to van Mander, in his later years, the Italian Renaissance painter Titian, quote, worked with brushstrokes that were bold and uneven and patchy, end quote. Although it's unlikely that Rembrandt ever saw a late Titian, he must have imagined and then emulated his idea of Titian's highly regarded late manner, an example of which you see on the right. Titian, not Rembrandt. Once he developed his signature style, that is, a recognizable manner of painting associated with the artist, which asserted his authorship in a competitive market, Dou barely deviated from it, although his compositions got progressively more copious and embellished. This style proved to be both esteemed and lucrative. The patronage Dou enjoyed in 17th century Holland was remarkable. Already by 1636, Queen Christina of Sweden's envoy to the Netherlands, Peter Spearing, was handsomely paying Dou annually for the right of first refusal of his paintings. This enabled Dou to continue working in the fine sculptor style, a technique that was time-consuming and therefore very expensive. Later in his career, Dou enjoyed a second Maecenas, Johann de Bay, who exhibited his collection of 27 paintings by Dou in a rented room in Leiden in 1665, perhaps the first one-man show in history. In addition to Leiden and The Hague, where Spearing was based until he moved back to Stockholm in 1650, Dou's works also appeared in inventories in Amsterdam and Delft during his lifetime, and shortly after his death were found in collections in Rotterdam, Middelburg, and Antwerp. Dou also enjoyed international fame. 3 of his paintings were part of the 1660 Dutch gift to Charles II of England on his accession to the throne, including the young mother on the left. In 1661, the Fleming Cornelis de Bay wrote that Dou's works, quote, bear our spirits almost higher than the stars, end quote. At his death in 1662, Archduke Leopold Wilhelm owned at least one of his paintings, which he likely bought during his governorship of the Netherlands between 1646 and 1656. Throughout the 1660s, foreigners were drawn to Dou's studio. In addition to what we've already talked about, these included the Dane Ole Borch, the Frenchman Balthazar Monconis, and Cosimo III de' Medici. Rembrandt's lifetime fame was perhaps not as widespread as Dou's, although it extended to Sicily, where Don Antonio Ruffo commissioned the great Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer that you see on the right, and, surprisingly, Genoa, where in 1666, Francesco Maria Sauli commissioned modelli from Rembrandt for 2 altarpieces for his family church. Furthermore, early on, his self-portraits could be found in several of the royal collections of Europe. The fine approach to painting was also practiced by artists with a more scientific bent. Like Dou, Jan van Kessel used his imagination to arrange his composition, here insects on a painting support, but the almost scientific description appears more matter-of-fact than Dou's combination of observed phenomena, including light, and artificially invented scenarios. Entomologists can actually identify each of the insects Jan van Kessel so carefully rendered in the Saunders painting. If you look closely, you'll see that he varied his approach. Some of his specimens are viewed from above, while others have been depicted from the side. Van Kessel's choice of a smooth copper surface on which a white ground has been applied was suited to the meticulous recording of these varied creatures. It is smoother and harder than panel, and thus enabled the artist to achieve an even more meticulous finish. Such a work is allied to the burgeoning interest, both in optics — the Dutch made great scientific advances in the development of the microscope and telescope in the 17th century — and global exploration, in which the Dutch were at the forefront. While some of the creatures in Van Kessel's painting are European, others are from tropical climes and South America. The work seems to simulate a drawer of prepared insects. We see here, and especially in the Saunders' still life with a crown of flowers at the left, the same impulse as was reflected in the contemporary interest in assembling Kunstkammers, or collector's cabinets. And you'll see the wonderful installation upstairs really takes that idea, and it's just such a very nice way to look at these smaller paintings in the Saunders collection. Anyway, these collector's cabinets sought to bring together the varied and wondrous natural and man-made art and artifacts available to the 17th century Dutch. And on the right is an example of a painted Kunstkammer by Frans Franken. In the 1640s, Jan van Kessel, the painter of the butterflies we just looked at, had trained in the workshop of his uncle, Jan Bruegel the Younger. Bruegel the Younger occasionally collaborated with his father, called Velvet Bruegel, because of the delicacy of his brushwork. It is the father who likely painted the flowers in the composition on the left, while his son probably painted elements like the tazza and the watch. In describing one of his paintings to his patron, Cardinal Carlo Borromeo, Jan Bruegel the Elder wrote, quote, "Under the flowers I've placed a jewel, with minted coins and with rarities from the sea. Your Excellency must judge for yourself if the flowers do not surpass gold and jewels," end quote. The Japanese jewelry box in the Saunders painting is a visual equivalent to the gold and jewels Bruegel had described to Borromeo. The flowers, studied from life, botanists can actually identify them, but from different seasons, are an imaginative combination meant to celebrate the diversity and bounty of God's creation. Another example of the Saunders' taste for the fine is evident in this small but spectacular work, one of the undisputed masterpieces of the collection, painted much later in the century. The support is paper laid down on panel, which provided a smooth surface for the meticulous description of fruit and bowl. The wild strawberries, which were actually the standard type under cultivation in Corta's day, have been depicted with botanical accuracy, and the carefully painted bowl can be identified as a specimen of blue and white Croc Wanli porcelain, brought from China by the Dutch East India Company ships. The precious bowl, which appears in 3 of Corta's paintings of wild strawberries, all dating 1704, is decorated with deer motifs. The Dutch East India Company, the world's first multinational conglomerate, had a virtual monopoly on pepper and nutmeg and controlled the bulk of trade in silks, tea, coffee, and porcelain from Asia. It and the West India Company would continue to generate unprecedented wealth for many in the burgeoning Dutch Republic well into the 18th century. And on the right, I show you a detail so you can see how Corta used dots of white lead and lead tin yellow to depict the individual seeds of the fruit. I've been focusing on how these works were painted because I'm working on an exhibition for Princeton scheduled for fall 2027, in which I want to explore this dichotomy of the rough and the smooth in 17th century Dutch painting. What determines an artist's style? I've briefly discussed the theoretical background. Engel and Gerrit Dou have valued the smooth style, the latter viewing it as modern. Saunders saw it as the result of great industriousness and remarkable patience, whereas Vasari and subsequently Van Mander advise artists to start with the neat manner before beginning the more difficult, rough way of painting, which according to writers like Theodorus Scrivelius and Roger de Piel, quote, gives life to the work, end quote. There were also market considerations. Artists intentionally developed a signature style in order to claim a segment of the art market. Art buyers knew what kind of painting to expect from which artists and what price point. And personal predilections. Dou was a fastidious bachelor who sat at his easel under a parasol to wait for the dust in his studio to settle. Rembrandt was reputedly obstinate and cared little what his patrons or critics thought, and continued to develop a radically innovative technique and manner of lighting associated with his reputation. So I'd like to walk you through the exhibition as it's currently conceived. The works I'll show you exemplify the ideas I'm exploring in the show, but they aren't all necessarily coming to the exhibition. So just to show you what I'm working on. The first section will look at artist signature styles. That is, artists working rough and artists working smooth. So these two paintings show serving maids who were reputed in the 17th century to have loose morals, hence the exaggerated décolleté of both figures. You'll notice the women wear the same red bodice and white shirt. At left, we see she wears a dark blue apron that would have hidden stains, as opposed to the woman of the house who wore a white apron because she wasn't worried about that. Both figures are distracted by something outside the picture space. The small painting on the left is by Dou. He's picked out every hair on the woman's head. The folds of her shirt are modeled in tones of white in the light, and in the shadows, white interspersed with gray. Because of the careful depiction of the fall of light and his ability to capture the gleam of the pewter tankard, for instance, the image appears naturalistic, but because of its size, it's quite small, you would never mistake it for anything other than a painted image. The life-size figure in the painting on the right is by Frans Hals, supreme master of the rough technique. The woman's shirt is composed of large, jagged strokes of white and gray. The artist has made no attempt to blend them. The background is sketchy and indeterminate. Both images toy with illusionism. Dou uses obvious tricks. He places the figure behind a niche, which is coincident with the picture plane, so she appears to lean out over the niche into our space. Hals's illusionism is achieved through his placement of the figure so close to the picture plane and his painting technique. She appears alive because of the liveliness of the brushwork. As I briefly mentioned, in 1648, the writer and poet Theodorus Scrivelius wrote that Hals, quote, excels almost everyone with a superb and uncommon manner of painting which is uniquely his. His paintings are imbued with such force and vitality that he seems to defy nature herself with his brush. One of the big challenges of doing this exhibition is it's conceived in pairs, and the pairs are often different sizes. So we have to come up with some way to make the pairs kind of work together and not be jarring in terms of you looking at something little and then looking at something big. Another challenge is getting a loan from the Louvre. So if any of you know anybody at the Louvre and would like to put in a word for why this is such an important loan, that would be great. In the 17th century, two generations of Dutch painters, primarily from Utrecht, the Catholic stronghold in the Netherlands, went to Rome and produced mainly pastoral subjects, bathed in warm southern light and set in an Italianate landscape. Many were characterized by ruins of past splendor, tinged with a certain nostalgia, which excited interest and admiration for patrons back home. The first generation of Italianate painters included Cornelis Pullenberg, whose small Rest on the Flight into Egypt is at left. Typical of him are the imaginary ruins filling the Roman countryside and the small biblical or sometimes mythological figures. The construction of his landscapes like this still depend on the Mannerist conventions of atmospheric perspective: dark foreground, green middle ground, and hazy blue background. The second generation of Italianates included Jan Bot, whose large landscape, suffused with golden light, you see at the right. Here, the Arcadian themes have been replaced by daily scenes of rural life. Both artists used labor-intensive, time-consuming, and refined techniques and relatively costly pigments, all of which would have made these works expensive. The Low Countries had a very different natural environment to the invented Roman countryside. Jan van Goyen's fluent wet-into-wet painting technique on the left captures the moist Dutch atmosphere. He painted his enormous output rapidly and with a limited palette, which made his works less costly, but no less appreciated for their virtuosity. Like Jan van Goyen, Solomon van Ruysdael was instrumental in developing a new approach to landscape painting. In the 1630s, his paintings had been concerned with tonal effects achieved with a limited palette. His mature compositions, like the one on the right in the Saunders Collection, shows a more monumental approach to the scene. The locale is identifiable by the tower, which is the Valkhof at Nijmegen, a site redolent of Roman, medieval, and more modern history. In the foreground, a boat ferries people and animals from shore to shore, and just beyond, fishermen are depicted hauling in their catch. Pleasure sailing ships are in the distance. The format and big sky with cumulus clouds in movement heroicize both the setting and the work of the laborers in and on the water. And this is the type of pairing I'm envisioning for the exhibition to show the contemporary smooth and rough landscapes side by side. The next section of the exhibition will look at artists working rough and smooth simultaneously. It's the smallest section of the show, but I wanted to show that in his early years, Frans Hals varied his technique depending on his subject. If he was commissioned to paint a portrait, here, pendant portraits of a married couple with the man on the left, as was the norm, and the woman on the sinister or right side, he deemed it of primary importance to delineate the specific physiognomy of the sitters and details of dress for which they were paying. There was no such need for restraint in his genre figures, though, which he painted much more roughly and freely at approximately the same point in time, as you see in the delightful pair of music-making figures in the Saunders collection at right. So he's working both rough and smooth at the same time. Yet even within the constraints of portraiture at this early date, Hals tended to paint the men more loosely than the women, evident not only in their faces, but also in their hair and clothes. The painting on the left is Rembrandt's portrait of the artist Jacques de Caen III, son of Jacques de Caen II, who put his enormous artistic gifts at the service of science, engineering, and warfare. Jacques III, whose artistic production was comparatively meager, acquired two or three of Rembrandt's paintings, painted in 1628 to 30, including those two old men disputing in Melbourne I showed you earlier. So he paid Rembrandt well to paint his portrait in 1632. At the same time, in the early 1630s, Rembrandt, like Hals, worked relatively more roughly for his tronies that you see at right. So he's working smoother for the people who are paying him for their physiognomy and their costume, and he's painting more roughly for these tronies. Although tronies may have been made from a particular model, capturing the model's features was not the object of the painting. Rather, Rembrandt used such works to study the fall of light and the old man's expression, recording it with broad, rapid, individual strokes of pigment, almost sculpting the man's wrinkles and the furrows of his brow. The peripatetic Jan Steen was one of the most versatile and engaging Dutch painters of the 17th century. On the left is an image of a baker and his wife with their wares, a combination of portraiture and genre painting. Although the woman and boy are better dressed, the baker is depicted in his working clothes. Both they and his features are more broadly painted than the figures in Steen's painting on the right, dating only a year or two later. It is concerned with upper bourgeois aspirations to gentility. Although it also includes portraits, the painting is an elaborate confection. Standing by the fireplace is the artist Jan Steen, next to the seated figure of Gerrit Schouten the Younger, a well-off Haarlem brewer. Schouten's children are ranged across the picture. The setting is likely the grote zaal, the biggest room in the home, and the interior is full of references to living nobly: tapestries, column fireplace, painting in an expensive gilt auricular frame, harpsichord, servants. To heighten their elegance, the artist has made the figures unnaturally tall and has painted the whole in his best fine schilder style. Here again, the artist seems to have modified his style depending on the nature of his subject. The work of Adrian van de Venne presents an interesting case. He worked very tightly and smooth when he was depicting the leisured pursuits of the moneyed class in his Middelburg period. And then when he moved to The Hague, he primarily produced grisaille or bruni, paintings in tones of gray or brown, mostly representing peasants and beggars, the riffraff or undeserving poor. He perfected a technique that required great skill, one that allowed him to turn out panels quickly and was at the same time highly valued by art lovers. These grisaille became a clearly recognizable product and also enabled the artist to speed up his production and enjoy savings in the cost of material. The third section of the exhibition is artists changing their style with time. Unlike Dou, Rembrandt's style changed radically over time. On the left is the portrait of Altje Allenburg, painted in 1632, a pivotal moment in the young Rembrandt's career. The sitter was the elderly cousin of Rembrandt's soon-to-be wife, and cousin, too, of Hendrik Allenburg, the art dealer with whom Rembrandt lodged when he moved from Leiden to Amsterdam. In Allenburg's workshop, Rembrandt honed his portrait painting skill by depicting himself, family members, and acquaintances while he began to obtain portrait commissions brokered by Allenburg. This early portrait displays incredible subtlety in paint handling, as well as in the characterization of his sitter. Rembrandt creates a symphony in black, brown, gray, and white. He alternates fine brushwork. Look at the flicks of a small brush that describe the fur standing up around her collar against the gray background, and the fine white line, kind of like that line at the side of the panel, the fine white line that traces the curve of her headdress. So he juxtaposes that with broader paint handling, evident in the application of the various shades of black and gray in her costume. Rembrandt's later work, as in the portrait of an unidentified woman at right, shows a much wider range of brushwork and finish. His application of paint is direct and varied, using everything from the ground to bold impasto to create depth of form, making certain elements advance or recede, and thereby helping to create an illusionistic form in space. Rembrandt is quoted as saying, quote, "A piece is finished when the artist has achieved his intention," end quote. So according to him, not everything had to be finished evenly or even completely. Hals, too, developed radically different styles in portraiture early and late in his career. In the painting at left, in which the sitter is relatively static, Hals in some way harkens back to the 16th century portrait tradition, with the skull alluding to the transience of life, giving the painting an allegorical twist. But the starched cambric ruff around the man's neck and the pleated cuff at the wrist of his right hand already exhibit the artist's incredible facility with the brush, even at this early date. The forms are suggested but not meticulously described. Hals was in his late 20s when he painted this portrait. What a distance he traveled in his career. The artist was in his 80s when he painted the portrait on the right. The disjointed brushwork with slashes of white standing in for collar and cuffs, and broad curved strokes of various browns for the sitter's hair, gives the appearance of spontaneity, immediacy, and liveliness. It might seem almost abstract had Hals not so ingeniously employed it to suggest material, volume, and a moment in time. Movement is further implied by the position of the sitter's hand and the angle of his body, while depth is suggested by the man's shadow cast on the back wall. In 1662, a few years before Hals painted the portrait on the right, the Flemish biographer Cornelis de Bie characterizes Hals' portraits as, quote, "very rough and bold, nimbly touched and well composed, pleasing and ingenious, and when seen from a distance, seem to lack nothing but life itself," end quote. However, these paintings by Hals were not quickly finished. He had to wait for the paint to dry before he applied another layer on top of it, so it required careful work over several sessions to achieve the effect he sought. He did not dash off these sketchy works, but intentionally selected, constructed, and employed his style to encourage viewers to think that he had. It's hard to believe that these two works are by the same hand, but they are by Jan Davidson de Heem. Early works by de Heem, like the one on the left, show him painting tonal works that reflect the bookishness of the university town of Leiden, as we discussed earlier. It is broadly and a bit roughly executed and painted primarily in tones of brown and white. During the 1630s, de Heem moved to Antwerp, where he spent most of the rest of his life. There he became known as a painter of sumptuous still lifes, which included precious objects and exotic foodstuffs, and floral bouquets, as brilliantly represented by the Saunders painting at right. This slide does not do this painting justice. When you go upstairs, it is just kind of a miraculous bit of painting. He was renowned not only for these exuberant arrangements in which he captured the specific qualities of each flower, its leaves and stems, but also for his technical virtuosity, which was achieved by applying bright colors in numerous delicate glazes. So this is the same kind of dichotomy that I showed de Heem. I'm also showing by Willem Kalf, who is kind of known as the Vermeer of still lifes. On the left, you see an early painting by him that shows kind of that rough and ready approach to painting. And on the right is a mature work that shows his amazing ability to paint light and describe various materials through that light. And then we have Adrian van Ostade, who was amazingly prolific. In his early years, You see a very rough style, as you see on the left, as befits his raucous, low-life subject matter. The brown tones in the background are thinly painted, and his use of individual brush strokes is apparent, but there's also lots of impasto in the foreground, especially, for example, in the whites of the figure's clothes. So this was Ostade's recognizable style, but his style evolved over time, and he painted the same type of subject as in his early work, but his later work features more color, a more refined technique, that is tighter brush work, more even lighting, a proliferation of meticulously rendered detail, a vertical rather than horizontal format, which adds to the stateliness of the image, and stronger individualization of the people. Everything has become more tempered and civilized and genteel, and his painting technique reflected this change in his attitude toward his subject. Nicolas Maas worked in Rembrandt's studio in Amsterdam for about 5 years, beginning in 1648. He then moved back to his native Dordrecht, where he painted paintings like the image on the left. His early portraits are half-length likenesses of men and women in sober black clothes with white collars against a plain background. Around 1670, he abandoned the so-called brownish or Rembrandtesque manner and started placing his figures in idealized settings, describing them with smooth, fluid, and refined brushwork. His poses become more graceful, and the images have more movement. Encouraged by his clientele's strong preference for being portrayed in a most sophisticated and civilized way, so as to identify with the aristocracy, Maas was following an international aristocratic portrait style in which influences of French culture and fashion began to make themselves felt. According to Halbrocken, he had a skilled and flattering brush with which he could capture a good likeness in a smooth manner, and if required, he was also prepared to improve his sitter's looks somewhat. And of course, I can't resist showing you these two portraits in the Saunders collection side by side, one from the beginning of the century and the other from the end. Sylvain couldn't resist it either in his beautiful installation, so you can go upstairs and see that. But I want to go quickly to the final section of the exhibition, which is the rough and the ascendant smooth by mid-century. Sitters in Amsterdam had a choice of portraitists working in wildly different styles by mid-century. Rembrandt's sitter at left is depicted with strong chiaroscuro and a stately bearing, as befitting his position as dike reeve, responsible for the care and oversight of the dikes and sluices that prevented flooding in the reclaimed land of the Low Countries. The artist used broad brushstrokes to define everything from his hands and cane to his face. This becomes old-fashioned when compared with Van der Helst's image of a fashionable sitter shown in a dashing, off-kilter pose at right, who presents himself as a gentleman with implications of nobility. Note the countryside setting and hunting dog. The work is smoothly painted, and the whole comes off as more relaxed and natural, which of course it is not. The same phenomenon can be traced in Haarlem. These two men each stand with one arm akimbo. The unidentified man in the Met painting at left has been painted by Hals in his mature, virtuosic, rapidly brushed manner, whereas the proud standard-bearer of the Haarlem Civic Guard on the right has been rendered by Verspronck in a slicker manner with more blended brushwork. The mere contrast in the clothing is enough to understand that one style was deemed more fashionable than the other, although we shouldn't ignore the feather in the man's hat and the green and pink ribbons at his waist in the Hals portrait. We'll end the walkthrough of the exhibition idea as we started with two self-portraits. Art de Gelder at left, Rembrandt's last pupil, was committed to the anti-idealistic tradition of chiaroscuro and championed the sketchy manner. This work, based on a late Rembrandt self-portrait, foregrounds the paint, not the dividers hanging from his work table, which were the traditional symbol for the abstract theories or classical rules in art. Earth colors predominate on his palette as they do in his painting, in contrast to the higher key colors and stronger light effects in Adriaan van der Werf's self-portrait at right. The elegant van der Werf shows himself as a court painter. He was in the employ of Johann Willem van der Paltz, Elector Palatine of the Wittelsbach dynasty. Note the gold chain, a gift of esteem from his noble patron. And he's working in his highly prized, refined style, holding a portrait of his wife as pictura, the personification of painting, and his daughter drawing on a blank canvas. De Gelder's opting for Rembrandt's mode of painting favored the past, whereas van der Werf's exquisite style reflected the appreciation of the smooth that dominated in Holland after mid-century. And I hope you enjoy the paintings that I've given you a preview of.